And thank you, and everyone, welcome to our first session of the evening with Deevia Bhana, which has her presentation titled Pleasure and Peril Young People Becoming Sexual in Digital Times. And this session is going to be moderated by Estelle Malgoza. So thank you very much, Estelle, for accepting doing the moderation. Thank you very much, Devia, for accepting presenting and being here today. And thank you very much to Adria for his translation and all the assistants that we're having today with us. Thank you and enjoy a lot the presentation.
Muchas gracias, Enaida, y buenas tardes a todos. Gracias, Devia. Entonces voy a empezar con esa moderación. So, hello, everyone. My name is Estelle Malgoza. I'm from AFIN Research Group from Autonomous University of Barcelona. And it's a great pleasure for me to introduce keynote speaker, Professor Deevia Bhana. I say great pleasure because her work has deeply inspired and influenced my own academic journey. Professor Bhana holds the South African Research Chair in Gender and Childhood Sexuality at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. She is co-chief editor of international journals such as Children and Society and Pedagogy, Culture and Society, and also associate editor of Sex Education. Her research explores how gender and sexuality come to matter in the lives of young people and what this means for childhood, sexual well-being, and gender justice. Through her work, she explores how heteronormativity, gender, race, poverty, and class intersect in shaping young people's sexualities, pleasures, desires, and risks across schools, families, intimate relationships, and digital spaces. She has published nearly 200 book chapters and peer-reviewed articles. Among her most recent books are Girls and the Negotiation of Porn in South Africa, Gender and Young People's Digital Sexual Cultures, and Gendered and Sexual Norms in Global South Early Childhood Education. So please join me in welcoming Professor Deevia Bhana, who will be giving her keynote entitled Pleasure and Peril, Young People Becoming Sexual in Digital Times. Thank you very much, Deevia.
Thank you very much for having me. Before I begin my presentation, I offer my sincerest appreciation to the many that matter in shaping my ideas and my thoughts. So this presentation leans on that global scholarship for which I'm very, very grateful. I also want to thank the University of Barcelona, Estelle Malgoza, and the team for inviting me as a keynote speaker to this event for many reasons, but I want to highlight two. First, we are living in an anti-gender climate, reducing the relevance of gender whilst reinstalling outdated understandings of gender as biological and as a binary. Second, as a South African, my work around gender and young people's digital cultures is in conversation with global and local gender projects, whilst also addressing real lives, people, places, and things based on and driven by children and young people's own viewpoints. In many ways, the work here in South Africa, while speaking to global issues, decenters knowledge from the confines of the global north. It is especially gratifying that this work is acknowledged in Spain. So thank you very, very much. And I say this because very often in the South, knowledge here is looked upon as localized production, only valuable for its raw material. And I borrow here from Maelstrom, Schaefer, and others who say that such knowledge seems to be valuable in terms of its extractivist nature rather than for contributing to global scholarship and thinking. So thank you very much again to the university for recognizing the work in the Global South. So social media platforms have become pivotal spaces. And so maybe I should just, before I begin, give you a sense of where I'm going to with my presentation. So these are the issues that I want to cover in this afternoon's presentation, just so that you have a sense of how I plan to go through the next hour. So I do want to give you some groundwork in terms of where I'm coming from, especially as you may not know the work that is being conducted here. I want to also conceptualize the firewall of patriarchy. I also want to give you a sense of what does it mean to be a young person in terms of gender and sexuality in the country. And then very briefly, suggesting to you our approach as well as the methods that have informed the work, and then providing you with just 2 examples of the many that exist in this work. And these 2 examples are linked to the title of this presentation. In the first example, I want to highlight the pleasure-danger conundrum, in which girls, teenage girls, talk about their desires and pleasures, whilst also referring to the gender inequalities and the materialization of gender as they work online. And in the second example, I'm going to provide a case study of a young Black 18-year-old man who's anonymously referred to as Sabelo, to illustrate how the Grindr app provides a space for pleasure, for exploring sexuality, but also contained by a dominant heteronormative culture. And then I would like to move on to what the implications of this work has been before I conclude today's session. So social media platforms have become pivotal spaces where young people seek validation and connection. These platforms provide opportunities for self-expression, for exploration, sexual exploration, but they also present new threats. In general, we are all more alert to the threats that define public debates and policies, which are often shaped, in Aurora's words, as a politics of despair. However, we still have little knowledge of what young people think about the possibilities of their digital interactions. Moreover, we know little of how these expressions are also entangled with gender, sexuality, race, and class. So with this presentation, I focus on how young people make sense of digital sexual cultures through exploring their pleasures as well as the gendered implications of their experiences. If we want to fully harness the potential of the digital world for young people and minimize risk, we have to move beyond binary thinking. Digital technologies are incessantly evolving, and while social media is a global trend, it is important to understand what happens at the local level and how. And this is why my presentation turns to young people in South Africa, as it engages with the local mediation of global trends. With the focus on a project involving 420 young people aged between 13 to 19, the presentation highlights the dual realities of pleasure and peril, of risk and pleasure, that characterize boys' and girls' experiences with digital technologies. I suggest also that there's great utility in understanding the entanglement of digital tech with gender and sexuality through a new materialist feminist lens, arguing strongly for seeing and focusing on digital tech as both a human and more than human experience. And so in this presentation, then, I will argue for recognizing how young people interact with digital technologies as a human and non-human experience. So these are then the key questions that we need to consider in terms of what young people think about the possibilities of their digital interactions, in what ways young people express their sexualities through digital technologies, the entanglement with race and class, and as I noted, the gendered implications of such engagements. Now, this work arises from a range of research studies, as Estelle kindly expressed, the publications around porn and about gender and young people's digital cultures, but it also has widespread international research outlet platforms, including in journals such as Sexualities, Gender Studies, Sex Education. So in this work, the idea that young people are indeed capable of and utilizing digital technologies in ways that expand their capacities, as well as in ways that materialize gender inequalities, is a major theme and a theme that I explore in this presentation. Okay, so let me then set the scene. Last year, Mark Zuckerberg of Meta and Instagram, along with 4 other prominent digital tech executives, faced the blunt accusation of blood on your hands in the US Senate Judiciary Committee hearing on big tech and the online child sexual exploitation crisis. What was the crime? It was claimed that their social media platforms are sites for the distribution of sexual images and grooming, serving as breeding grounds for sexual predators who target young people. And by that, I mean minors under the age of 18, as well as for human trafficking. At this Judiciary Committee, the tech executives were berated for failing to protect young people and were accused of doing little to safeguard the children and young people from online sexual dangers. The image of grieving families holding pictures of their children whose lives had been tragically affected by online harms pointed to the urgent need for better protection measures. Zuckerberg apologized for harmful online sexual abuse and added that everyday teens and young people do amazing things on our services. They use our apps to create new things, express themselves, explore the world around them, and feel more connected to the people they care about. In my study, I am interested in both what they do in terms of creatively exploring sexuality, as well as the pervasive forms of harms and gendered inequalities that they confront and experience and are complicit in producing on a daily basis. So all around the world, young people's interactions with digital technologies and social media through mobile phones, computers, and other digital devices have become a rallying point over childhood sexuality and subsequently a subject of intense concern. Young people, unlike many of us in our 50s and 60s, are coming of age at a time of increasing digital complexity as young people and children navigate new sexual terrains which contribute to adult anxieties about their sexualities. These anxieties are hardly surprising, given that the relationship between minors and sexuality remains to date controversial. So in this presentation, I configure this debate in relation to the experiences of children and young people in South Africa and address these transversal and cross-cutting issues that do affect young people in all parts of the world, but also in South Africa. 1 out of every 3 internet users is a child. And in the global South, it is estimated that even among the poor, it is higher. In South Africa, the Disrupting Harm study suggested that children aged between 9 and 17 who participated in a household study, 58% went online at least once a day. The frequency of internet use among children did not vary based on gender or whether they lived in an urban or a poorer rural area. The study also found instances of online sexual exploitation and abuse, including blackmail, the non-consensual sharing of images, as well as children's experiences of receiving non-consensual nude images. So the efforts then to create a global response, sorry, my machine is, I'm going to go back. So the efforts to create a global response to regulating young sexualities coincides at a historical moment when young people themselves are actively challenging traditional norms of sexuality through technologies. So these platforms, as I noted, provide opportunities to publicize and explore and express their sexuality. And it includes courting practices, dating, flirting, and learning about sexuality, which are now all supported by social media platforms, including TikTok, WhatsApp, Instagram, and Snapchat. And these remained very significant platforms in South Africa. So these platforms enable young people to post selfies, interact with suggestive digital stickers, emojis, nude pictures, videos, and other image-based sexual practices, including porn and sexting. The ubiquity of digital technologies and the decreasing costs of cell phones means that young people, even those living in poverty, have now unprecedented opportunities to explore and express sexuality. So in South Africa, 91% of households own a cell phone, with almost 22 million users using smartphones. So it is not naive to be optimistic about the potential that this device has for young people in reimagining the publicization of their sexualities. To date, however, we have very little consideration in the global South more generally, but in South Africa in particular, about young people's sexual wishes or the need for young people to develop online and offline skills to explore sexuality in a gradual, intentional, and pleasurable fashion. Young people's digital experiences are often overshadowed and reduced to opposing schools of thought as a canvas of sexual peril or a haven for expression. So these polarities between risk and creation reduce young people's engagement with social media to a reductive binary. And this dichotomy obscures what young people are actually doing online, either by idealizing their digital practice, as Mark Zuckerberg illustrated, or being victims of being victims of online sexual predators. So coming back then to the two main questions that I seek to explore in all the research that I've conducted with my team: in what ways do young people express sexuality, and what are the gendered implications of these digital sexual engagements? And again, while research is focusing on risk and harm, of course, justifiably, I think it's also important to focus on pleasure. So my ideas about pleasure and peril draws then from this large empirical study of involving 9 high schools and 1 primary school in South Africa. And in this project, young people spoke to me about their devices, their excitement and passions, their experiences with sexting and selfies. as well as their anxieties and their experiences of sexual danger. They spoke about their engagement with porn, the practice of ranking girls, boys' practice of ranking girls online, slut shaming, as well as girls fighting for boys online. These practices included connection with what I call the non-human or the more than human in terms of stickers and nudes and emojis, and how these activities reflect heteronormative ideals, but these are also negotiated through race, gender, and class. I want to reiterate at this point the need for contextual specificity in locating young people in South Africa. As many of you might know, South Africa is a rainbow nation and sliced through by race and class settings, meaning that in some contexts, we have high levels of poverty, and in others, poverty seems to be an obscure experience. Nonetheless, in research conducted with young people, a shared theme was the experience of pleasure as well as the experience of danger. At this point in the presentation, I want to focus briefly on this firewall of patriarchy. Just as a firewall in computing protects a network from unauthorized access and attacks, the firewall of patriarchy here is used as a metaphorical concept, not in a reductive way, but to illustrate technology's capacity to shield patriarchal systems from challenges and changes that might threaten its dominance. The firewall of patriarchy is a way of conceptualizing while also probing the boundaries of patriarchy. More specifically, while young people have new affordances to challenge gender norms and express their sexuality, their experiences might not contribute to the broadening of sexualities, and instead, their experiences might be circumscribed by the firewall of patriarchy. So, as many scholars state, technology may dazzle, but it can also destroy lives. At this point, several scholars have drawn upon the concept, another concept that I draw upon scholars is this notion of rape culture. And in this rape culture, heterosexist normalization of rape, of violence, of the subordination of women continues in online spaces. Whilst this term rape culture has been problematized for homogenizing girls' experiences, it is also a very useful tool for connecting and creating solidarity and allyships online to counteract women and girls in subordination, as well as others, young men who are also subordinated. So one of the arguments that I make is that young people constantly come up against the firewall of patriarchy. And this offers new insights and empirical depth into their contextual experiences. Their sociocultural material surroundings impact on their digital cultures, where gendered patterns are often shaped by traditional norms around masculinity and femininity, encouraging particular patterns for appropriate conduct. Sociocultural expectation embody different ideals of appropriate gender norms in ways that encourage masculinity and femininity in familiar ways and in relation to power hierarchies. So new platforms provide opportunities for enjoyable sexual interactions, but they are indeed constrained by this culture of rape. In this part of my presentation, I want to provide you with some insight into the experience of gender and sexualities in South Africa. And the slide is self-explanatory because it suggests that this firewall for patriarchy and the ensuing spread of violence in South Africa is a cause of great concern. And this troubling behavior has manifested online. Young people's digital sexual cultures are modulated through the entanglement of online and offline lives. South Africa, sadly, has often been regarded as the rape capital of the world, where girls and women and girls' disproportionate vulnerability to gender and sexual violence is also linked to sexual risk and disease. Indeed, one feeds into another. And considering this backdrop is essential in understanding the experiences of young people in my study. So this perennial problem quite simply means that the subordination of femininity follows us into cyberspace. In South Africa, historically, women indeed have faced an environment, including the legacies of apartheid and colonialism, where patriarchal structures meant that women's bodies were subordinated. Customary practices, religious and heteronormative expectations, and masculine norms have all come together to reinforce the idea, not simply the idea, but the experience of violence and violence against women in this country. However, scholars have, in contemporary South Africa, scholars have attested to the paradox between a rights-based constitution and a patriarchal society, where gender and cultural norms reinforce masculinity that are risky and which have negative outcomes for women and girls. So even 31 years after the end of apartheid, questions about race, about class, about sexual violence, about broader sense of inequalities perpetuate our social and political landscape. And feminist scholarship in the country has drawn attention to the intersecting forces of history, of compulsory heterosexuality, of customary practice that reinforce gender norms and female sexual subjectification. And the slide is indicative of the context in which inequalities and fragile masculinities have reinforced women and girl subordination. We do have several policies in the country, including the National Strategic Plan on Gender-Based Violence, which was launched in 2020 to reduce violence. However, we also know that policy and a broad conundrum exists between policy and practice. So just quickly to rehearse, in this part of the presentation, I provided you with a brief context in which we are operating, in which children and young people's digital lives emerge. And I think this is valuable in understanding the broader project and how digital and sexual culture. Next, here I would like to suggest to you that our approach in terms of understanding young people's interaction with digital cultures takes on an assemblage approach. And I have given you an indication of this earlier on, but just simply here to reiterate. The assemblage approach involves the entanglement of all matter, drawing on Deleuze and Guattari, Barad, and others in terms of a new materialist framework. How matter, ideas, norms, contexts, places, people, objects, and things all come together in a sophisticated analysis of young people's digital sexual cultures. And all of these, all matter is then interdependent. And the reason why I focus on this here is that when we think about how we might prevent and how we might create digital futures that are safe and again based on rights, we need to understand the interdependence of all matter. In this slide, I present to you a broad framing of the methods involved in the study and the broad project, which encompasses 420 young people, as I noted, from 9 high schools and 1 primary school in South Africa, across the race class context, involving urban and peri-urban schools, as well as private schools, involving the broad rainbow context of South Africa across the race spectrum. The study also included, typical qualitative methods, as well as arts-based methods, where children and young people participated in drawings, and photo elicitation methods. We also use vignettes and short fictional scenarios in order to emphasize the significance of providing a platform for hearing from children and young people themselves. So now I want to come to the sort of juicy part of the presentation, in which I want to focus firstly on intimate assemblages in relation to how young girls spoke about the role of digital technologies in shaping relationships. I won't read these out to you, but you could. And maybe I'll just read the first one, how young girls between the ages of 16 and 18 talked about social media platforms, digital technologies more broadly, playing a huge role in their relationships. I don't think I would have been together if it wasn't for social media. It makes you closer. It makes us bond more. Also referring to video calls and half-naked video calls makes you closer. So the close connection. And of course, the sexualized nature of these interactions. I have to say that adult anxiety means that they do not wish to listen to the actual voices of young people in relation to what they really do online, and instead the obsession with sexual danger without denying it, because I provided you with a platform, especially in South Africa, about the way in which sexual danger manifests in everyday life. But I want to say, as Carol Vance did so many decades ago, that if we are to understand sexuality online, we cannot simply focus on danger, and we have to understand what this slide suggests to you, the ways in which intimacy is produced within online platforms. In the next slide, which is even more sexualized, young girls at age 16, 17, and 18 are very much aware of orgasms. The word cum is a reference point, and that expressions about being horny and about making their relationships even more secure through these digital platforms are very key to contemporary patterns of young people's digital sexual cultures. These including These included the use of emojis and stickers. However, there was also the firewall of patriarchy and the pervasive forms of gendered inequalities. Young people's entanglement with social media also reinforced existing gendered and sexualized relationships based on gendered hierarchies and masculine entitlements. Digital technologies then may reinforce inequalities, but at the same time, they might also permit justice as girls reorientate their assemblage towards equality and agency. By that, I mean that when young girls spoke to me and to the team about their experiences of violence and inequalities, they were also using the research as a platform to raise awareness of their own experiences of territorialization. And so research conducted in this way provides platforms for expanding the assemblage towards recognizing girls' agency, recognizing their capacity to reflect, but also to reflect upon their experiences of violence and perhaps to move to something different. These were the examples of the emojis that were used in expressing sexuality. And I'm going to quickly slide through these, the different versions and the different ways in which emojis are sexualized. Right, and then at this part of the presentation, I want to address another important area. And this is the app that, and using the case study of one young 18-year-old man, and we calling him Sabelo, and he's 18 years old and referred to the Grindr app. He also self-identifies as a Black gay man. He attends a high school in the peri-urban Black township. And whilst the emerging research, including my own, talks about heterosexual digital cultures, what I'm illustrating here through the narratives in terms of Sabelo's own words illustrated on this slide is the ways in which Grindr provides an expansion of platforms for sexual expression beyond heteronormativity. Here we see that for Sabelo, the Grindr app provides an opportunity for thinking outside of the heteronormative framing, for meeting someone, for chatting with someone, and that Grindr is indeed that space. But I also have to illustrate here that Sabelo is navigating a heteronormative context where coming out as a Black gay man can be extremely dangerous. And I say this in the context of South Africa's hostile environment, but also progressive. And here is then the conundrum that young people also are navigating their sexualities and sexualities outside of heteronormative conditions, where being gay is and could be used to create hostility and, of course, to be attacked and stigmatized, even killed, alongside a very, very progressive democracy where equality on the basis of sexual orientation is entrenched in our democracy. And I have this here, that these constitutional rights coexist with sexual prejudice. So non-normative expressions challenge binary constructions of gender and sexuality, showing that pleasure, desire, and identity are fluid and contextually shaped, and that the Grindr app, I think it was established in 2009, provides young men like Sabelo an opportunity to subvert dominant sexual scripts. At the same time, Sabelo illustrated his fear in relation to navigating both his home life and schooling in coming out as gay. And he spoke about continuous stigmatization of non-normative sexualities in which he had to pretend to be heterosexual. So again, in terms of the dominant theme of my presentation, pleasure and peril, what we can observe here in terms of the expression of non-normative sexuality is that digital tech, like Grindr, can provide an opportunity for young Black men like Sabelo in South Africa with an opportunity to express sexuality in ways that are private, in ways that are undercover, whilst at the same time reflecting upon the dominant heterosexual discourse, which can penalize. Before I conclude my presentation, and I have about 15 minutes, I want to focus on what this means for sexuality education, for sexual rights, for children and young people, and of course, more broadly and generally, the implications for sexuality education. I think I want to address the concept of sexual citizenship, and I borrow here from the work of Jeff Hearn and other scholars like Jennifer Hirsch and Kahn. So sexual citizenship then establishes conditions that foster the capacity for sexual determination, enabling individuals to feel secure, capable, and entitled. Now, oftentimes, when we consider citizenship and sexual citizenship in particular, it seems as if this is reserved for adults. I want to stress here that sexual rights are rights for all, and that includes children and young people. And addressing the complexities of gender in young people's digital sexual cultures is deeply entwined with questions around sexual citizenship. Sexual citizenship is gendered, embodied, and its spatialized claims to sexual entitlements, which include free expression, bodily autonomy, institutional inclusion, and sexual responsibilities that are non-exploitative and non-expressive and non-oppressive. So this term highlights young people's capacities to navigate the online world, not as is currently the case, in which they are blocked, obstructed, and denied access, but to navigate the online world with access to information, the right to express sexual autonomy, and experience their sexual rights with respect and dignity. Their right to sexual digital literacy, privacy, protection, and their right to build relationships and safety from sexual harassment and violence underline this term, digital sexual citizenship. And sexual citizenship is post-digital as it interacts with digital technologies and is also seen as a biotechnological entanglement. I think it's important to understand digital sexual citizenship, as it is a key concept that can enable rethinking how we can secure young people's sexual rights. Young people are engaging with digital technologies from our research without support. And they are engaging in it with actually no adults coming into their lives, asking questions about how they experience it, notwithstanding the fact that we have evidence that South Africans are online almost 5 hours a day. So they do need assistance to explore their emergent sexualities. They need to be protected from patriarchy and rape culture and heteronormative masculinities. And so far, policies are focused mainly on protection and moral panic, which deny young people access to their rights, to their privacy, and their right to free expression. Of course, it is true that safety legislation in itself cannot remedy the problem, but it is important. A point that I noted in terms of thinking with assemblages means that when we consider digital sexual citizenship, when we think about what might be the best way in terms of young people's digital futures, we must also think about these digital futures as an entanglement with all matter. Which also brings me to the question of sexuality education manifesting as part of digital sexual citizenship as well. And we need to reframe sexuality education, which recognizes digital sexual citizenship, which recognizes pleasure as a right for children and young people. And of course, we need to also understand that pleasure manifests itself in different ways when you are a child, when you are a teenager, and when you are an adult. And that is why research such as the one that we're doing in South Africa is so important to illustrate how and in what ways pleasure is formatted in terms of how children and young people express and how they themselves see pleasure. I think it's important then for digital sexual citizenship, as for sexuality education, to draw on issues around masculinity in terms of rape culture and in terms of the firewall of patriarchy, and that we need to form feminist allyships in terms of addressing the problem. I think it's imperative that we move beyond the binaries of risk and resource in terms of creativity and in terms of danger. We need to navigate between these two, and we need to foster online environments and respect for young people's sexual autonomy whilst mitigating risks. And I draw from Hirshen Khan, who states so eloquently that educating young people is everyone's job. It's not restricted to schools, to families, to policy, to departments of education, to social welfare, to big tech. It is indeed everyone's job. And so this requires governments, tech companies, teachers, communities, parents, families, peers, siblings, to challenge patriarchal norms. And we also need to be careful about legislation being pushed through under the guise of moral panic, which emphasizes protection. Of course, no one here is denying the need for protection, but at the same time, the need for digital sexual citizenship. Safety policies that are focused solely on restriction. They expand adult surveillance, whilst reinforcing the restriction on childhood sexualities. Big tech is both a problem and a solution. Digital sexual cultures are emerging in terms of a rapidly evolving digital space, and research needs to keep up with this evolving digital context. And finally, I want to end my presentation in terms of, despite then the kind of patriarchal context, the firewall of patriarchy, the culture of rape, the inequalities that girls experience and young men as well, but also the pleasures, the passions, the excitement that digital technology provides them in expanding sexualities, like young sexualities, like we've never seen before. And so I want to end then with Aurora's statement that hope is not an option. It is a moral imperative for an inclusive and responsible digital future. Thanks very much.
I will thank you, Professor Deevia Bhana, for your fantastic presentation. It's a big honor to assist in your presentation. So thank you very much.